Thanks all for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to be here with you as a nice little wellness break at the end of my day. My name is Carly Lennox. I'm one of the new executive committee members of the Emerging Leaders Network. Before we get started, I'm just going to open our call with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that this is an online event, so navigating the best way to make an acknowledgement is still something we're working on, but we felt it was important to not leave out, so bear with us. CivicAction acknowledges that the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area is situated upon traditional and current Indigenous territories that include the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, and Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. The treaties that cover these territories include the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, and the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize the historical oppression and inequities that they continue to face. In our role as a civic convener, CivicAction is committed to rebuilding and renewing respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and support the important work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The current Emerging Leaders Network Executive Committee has identified this as a priority for our 2-year term, and I'm looking forward to working with the committee members and partners to make progress on this work. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the ELN, we are a creation of the CivicAction Leadership Foundation, here to develop, connect, and activate the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area's future leaders. Created in 2006, the ELN is 2,500 rising leaders strong and represents a wide range of ethnocultural backgrounds, communities, and sectors throughout the GTHA. We continue to grow the network of rising leaders, build their leadership toolkits, and incubate new ideas to solve our region's most challenging civic issues. Recently, as a response to COVID-19, we launched ELNonline for new digital programming to keep our network connected and engaged, recognizing that while the challenges we face today are difficult, the need for civic engagement and community has never been greater. For more information about some of this great programming we have lined up, or to join our mailing list if you aren't already on it, check out our website at leadership.civicaction.ca. Again, that's leadership.civicaction.ca. We'll also send out a link in the follow-up email after this webinar. Speaking of great programming, I'm so pleased to be your host for ELNonline Mental Wellness. Since the arrival of COVID-19 in our region, we've heard countless stories of rising leaders rising to the challenge. Yet we know this tumultuous time is also taking its toll. In our recent outreach to our network, we heard that over a third of rising leaders are struggling with their mental well-being right now. As rising leaders in our workplaces and communities, we have a dual role of supporting our own mental health while also supporting those who look to us for guidance and help. So in today's discussion, Championing Mental Wellness on Teams, we're going to be discussing why it's critical that we cultivate mental wellness within our organizations and communities during this time, and also how we can be a supportive champion of mental well-being on our own teams, whether that's at work, in your community work, within your family, or whatever that means to you. I want to recognize that many of us are experiencing this pandemic differently. Some of us are lucky to still be employed or working from home. Some have lost jobs. Some of you are working on the front lines. So whether you're stocking shelves at the grocery store, working in a hospital, or delivering food or packages to our front door, thank you. Before we jump into today's discussion, I'm going to give a quick overview of some housekeeping items. So we've left the second half of today's webinar open to a Q&A with all of you. So you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions there, and you can also vote for other questions that you like that have been asked. We're going to try to work through as many questions as we possibly can, but we're going to start with the questions that are at the top that have the most votes. So the more votes the question has, the higher it will be in the Q&A box, if that makes sense. If you have any questions about that, just ask us in the chat box. We also want to use this as an opportunity to share helpful mental wellness resources within our network. Things like online tools, podcasts, articles, anything that you're finding is helping you stay well and healthy during this time. I encourage you to add your thoughts to the chat feature, and we're going to compile a list into a Google Doc and send it around to everyone who attended today so we can continue to share. And we did the same for the first webinar, so we'll just continue building that list. And then again, if you're having any tech issues, just post in the chat and someone from our team will reach out to you. With that, let's get started. It is an honor to introduce you to the fantastic panel we have with us today. Jordan Friesen is the National Director of Workplace Mental Health with the Canadian Mental Health Association. Thanks for joining us, Jordan. Liz Horvath is the Manager of Workplace Mental Health, Opening Minds at the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Hi, Liz. Thanks for being here. And Anjum Sultana is the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada, and she's the founder of Millennial Women in Policy. Anjum, appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks to the team for organizing.
So I'm going to start jumping into our panel questions. How are you all doing? What are some things you're doing during this challenging time to prioritize your own mental well-being?
Well, hi, and thanks again for having me. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today and to engage on this important topic. I think, to answer your question, Carly, how am I doing? I will say that it's been a bit of a roller coaster, personally, professionally, and everything in between. I would say I'm doing relatively well, although that varies from day to day, but the key takeaway from me in terms of what's been really helpful for maintaining my own mental health has been actually a lot of relearning some habits and practices that I had previously used but had completely forgotten about. So in some sense, I'm grateful for the global pandemic to help reorient me to some of those things that I know are good for me that I've just been neglecting for a long time. So things like physical activity, for example, or even just connecting back with friends. And in that vein, I think what's been helpful too is evaluating the relationships I have in my life and which ones are actually supporting me and which ones are actually not supporting me. So that's been helpful too. I would say, that my biggest struggle in all of this is not so much having to stay home or work from home. It is definitely health related and primarily mental health related. So, if I had to rank the most difficult things about this pandemic, admittedly, it would be at the top of the list.
Thanks for sharing that, Jordan. That definitely resonates with me.
Yeah, and I reiterate what Jordan's saying. I mean, overall, doing pretty well, given everything that's going on. But I do find also that I'm having intermittent waves of sadness, grief, overwhelm, as we're trying to navigate this. And I mean, I've been working at home for 7 years, so I'm fairly well equipped and I'm well set up for that. But now we're working at the computer so much more, but we're also having to deal with the impact of everything that's happened around us and the isolation from friends and family. I'm not able to go and hug my mom or hug my grandchildren. I miss them so much. But on the other hand, one of the things that I do is I practice gratitude every day, and I try to do it often every day. And you'll see I actually have a sign behind me that reminds me to do that. So when I walk in my office, that's the first thing I see. And so, some of the self-care and resilience practices that we teach other people, I've had to make sure that I'm actually doing it myself, and doing things like connecting with friends and family, like taking dedicated time to do that, even though it's online, doing things like, time blocking to make sure that I'm not overworking, because it can be really easy to overwork during this time. And we really need to take that time to recharge our batteries and just get that energy level up. Taking time to get out into the garden or to go out into nature. We love to go kayak fishing, and that wasn't open until just this past week. So we got out there and went and did some kayak fishing out on the river, which was just incredible. And other things like just making sure to get up and do my routine in the morning, do my yoga, do my prayers, focus on my hygiene, getting dressed, and then having a shutdown period during the evening where I'm just, I'm not focused on COVID. I'm just focused on getting myself relaxed and helping to calm my mind so that I can get a good restful sleep. And good nutrition, hydration, all of those kinds of things that go into just keeping your resiliency up. But I found that when I'm going through those waves, those intermittent waves, I really have to give myself some self-compassion and remind myself to practice what I preach, because these are the things that I would tell other people to do, but I have to remember to do them myself.
So hard, isn't it, Liz? I don't know. I've had a similar experience. I've spent a lot of time, in webinars just like this, giving people advice and telling them what they should be doing to look after their mental health. But trying to apply that to my own life has been really hard. And I think in every leader, there's an element of having to figure out how to apply the same types of strategies to yourself that you want to develop in other people that you're leading. This is a great example of it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because we have to lead by example too, and our lives depend on it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anjum, how are you doing?
Oh yeah, thanks for asking. And I think maybe what I'll do is share a bit of a story of like what my headspace was in March. So our organization, we do have consultative status with the United Nations, and each year they host a conference on the rights of women and gender equality more broadly. And that was supposed to happen the week of March 9th. It also happened to be the same week that the World Health Organization called COVID a global pandemic on March 11th. And so for us, it was really interesting because this was a really important year for the work that we do globally in Canada, but it's also our anniversary year for our organization. It was our 150. So we had these key deliverables that were really critical during this month of March. So it was a lot of pivoting. It was a lot of also, being grateful that we had the ability to kind of make that decision and not go and stay safe because the event was going to take place in New York. But it was also, I think at the same time, a lot of us are feeling a sense of grief for the life we would have had, the actions and things that we were supposed to do, both personally and professionally. So on a personal note, March was a really challenging time, not only for the best laid plans that were kind of led astray because of this global crisis, but also how do we pivot from this moment and rethink about what we need to do in our work, but also personally. So that was something definitely that was really challenging in the month of March. But I think April and May, what was really gratifying and what I found a lot of gratitude in, speaking to Liz's point, is around service. That's something that's very core to me as a person, but also for many of the communities I'm part of, and I'm sure for the ELN community more broadly. And research is quite clear. When you volunteer and give back, that's good for your mental health. It builds that sense of connection, especially when we're all physically distanced. And it also, some studies have shown that's also good for physical well-being, whether it's like lowering blood pressure or reducing stress overall. So that's something I've definitely been leaning into. That's been really helpful. I think what I want to share, and this might be the case for a lot of the folks listening, is that I feel very grateful that I still have a job where I can physically distance and work remotely, but that's not the case for a lot of folks, like Carly mentioned. And so in people's households, the workers, one person on your organization might have a job, but someone else in that person's household might not, and the financial strain. So that person themselves might be doing okay, but for the entire kind of unit, the household, whether it's roommates or family members or other folks, that's something that people are grappling with. And I think about, the city of Toronto and the greater Toronto and Hamilton area. I know people are also probably grappling with, we have connections all around the globe. The city of Toronto has more than half the population. People were born outside of Canada. So just thinking about that local and global connection, many of the team members in my organization, but also specifically on my team, they have family in other parts of the world. So that's another dimension, I think, when you are a leader, thinking about all the different aspects of someone's life. I'll share, for example, my own dad. my dad, he lives here in Toronto. He's an essential worker. So he is getting up every day and going in physically to the workplace. Before he enters, he works at a cookie factory. He has to actually be tested, his temperature, before he can go in. So in the first couple of weeks, I was quite concerned because he is also an older guy. But fortunately, he has access to personal protective equipment. He has access to paid sick leave, and he has the ability to take time for himself if he needs to maybe not go into work. But I know that's not the case for everyone. So I think one of the things I've been thinking about, and I think a lot of organizations, is how do we build back better? And I think mental health in the workplace, looking at that holistically, is a good place to start.
Just building on what you're saying, Anjem, you hit something really key there, that, that there's other people in the realm that we're dealing with. So when we are thinking about, all the things that have been canceled, I mean, professionally and personally, and we're dealing with that, but the people within our home and the people within the groups that we're dealing with, whether it's our professional groups, the volunteer groups that we're dealing with, our friends, our family, they're all dealing with their own levels of sadness, grief, shock, disbelief, struggling with kind of what they're going through, and really try, as we're trying to help ourselves, we're also trying to help other people as well. And the one thing that I found when it comes to volunteering, though, is that some of the people that I know really get into volunteering so much that they actually burn themselves out from volunteering. And even in my own case, I had to pull back a little bit from the amount of volunteering that I was doing because my workload increased so much. And that was a difficult thing. So again, practicing that self-compassion to be able to say, I really want to do this, and this really does help me, just from a spiritual aspect of my own, spirit and what I want to do in life. And but having to step back and say, it's okay for me not to do that, and recognize that also gives somebody else the opportunity to step up into that role, and they may really benefit from that too. So it's been a kind, just like you said, Jordan, a real roller coaster.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things that popped to mind, key insights that CMHA has been sharing for quite a while. The first one is that, if you happen to be in a place where you're working from home, remember that, that you're not really working from home. You're at home trying to stay safe and healthy during a pandemic and trying to get some work done. And that helps reframe things, not only for you, I think being compassionate towards yourself around what you're actually able to contribute right now, but also helps you be compassionate towards others. McKinsey, a large consulting firm, released some best practices for leaders in what they call a landscape crisis, which is what this is. And one of those practices was actually empathy. And so this ties into, I think, what Liz and Anjem were both saying, in that there are a lot of people in very different situations and dealing with things in their personal lives that are now intersecting with their work life in ways that they may not have ever before. So there's a huge role for empathy as a leader here, and I'll also say vulnerability as well, but that's a slightly larger one to unpack. And then the other one, I think as well, that is sort of a key message that has really helped me, is understanding that this global pandemic, just by nature of what it is different from many other crises that we may have experienced in the past. And a foundation of, many people understand or think they understand the concept of resilience. And it's often thought of as this skill or muscle that you have to exercise on your own, right? It's my job to become more resilient. And while there's an element of truth to that, the other very real aspect of resilience is that, resilience is formed through relationship and social connection. A part of being resilient is being able to tap into the support of others when you need to. And so just by virtue of the fact that, we have to be 2 meters apart from everybody at all times, that in and of itself adds an extra layer of complexity to this pandemic and how we cope with it, because it's fundamentally restricting our ability to exercise our resilience. So I think giving yourself a little bit of grace is really important right now.
Such a nice perspective to add, Jordan. Thanks. I think that's a really nice way to end that question. If I'm okay to move on to the next one, is everyone okay with that? Thanks for sharing all of that. I think that leads us really well into the next question, which is, what extra responsibilities do leaders have during this unique time to ensure the mental well-being and safety of their teams? Angela, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So kind of going back to this point, we're working from home, some of us, but we're working during a pandemic. And I think what this is really bringing to the forefront is all the different roles that we play in our lives. So working at a gender equity organization, we've been quite clearly looking at the gendered impacts and the intersectional impacts of this crisis. And one of the things that we're seeing, for example, in the province of Ontario is schools are closed for the rest of the year. So for a lot of workers, a lot of parents, not only are they working, let's say they're 9 to 5, and they might actually be changing the hours to address their care needs, they're also serving as teachers. They're also perhaps increasing their other duties to their loved ones, whether it's also elder care. So I think just thinking about all of those different aspects, those roles that people are playing during this pandemic, all of that's coming to the forefront, and that is going to add additional pressures, additional stress. So I think as the leader in a workplace is being mindful of that additional duties. At YWCA, we often call this now the triple burden. Before the pandemic, it was the double duty, if you will, for a lot of working parents, and oftentimes there's a disproportionate imbalance in terms of that household labor, skewing more towards women and femme-identifying folks. But I think this is across the board, that amount of work we have to do has increased. So that's one piece. I think also as leaders, this was an issue before the pandemic, but we are seeing, unfortunately, and in Canada as well, a rise in incidents of hate, of racism, of misogyny, of different oppressive behaviors and practices that are impacting people individually, but at a community level too. You open up the newspaper and you see so many different incidents happening over the last 10 weeks or so across the country. So I think as a leader, it's really talking about that, because that is something that impacts someone's mental well-being. If members of their community are being targeted or attacked physically or verbally or otherwise. So I think that's something also to have those conversations is crucial. And so, checking in and actually identifying that and talking about that. I think also it shows as a leader, you're compassionate and you're understanding someone is a multidimensional person, and all of these different aspects are coming to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've just hit on at the last point that you made, Anjum, is really, again, like, comes back to empathy, right? It's an extra responsibility of leaders, although to be fair, I think it's a responsibility of leaders all the time. A part of some of my reflection has been people asking, questions just like this, like what do leaders need to be doing to support their employees' mental health in the times of a pandemic? And fundamentally, it's a lot of the same things leaders should be doing all the time to support the mental health of their employees. And I think what's really helpful to understand is that what is considered to be effective leadership in times of a crisis or times of major change, those principles are many of the same principles that describe what effective leadership looks like to foster psychological health and safety. And so the two are actually quite well aligned. And so that's been a helpful consideration for me. So empathy is really big in my books. Vulnerability is the other one. And so if we think about the concept of psychological safety, I know Liz is well-versed in what our national standard for Canada talks about, so I'm going to leave that to you, Liz. But vulnerability plays a huge role in creating a safe and trusting environment. So as leaders, what I would say is your responsibility is to know and understand and express your understanding of what your teams are going through, but also to share some of what you're going through. because it's going to increase the sense of trust that they have with you. It's going to build a more collaborative relationship. And fundamentally, they're going to understand that you're a human being too. And really, what more is work than a collection of human beings trying to get along and do something good together, right?
Nicely put, Jordan. And I want to ask you a little bit more about that empathy question, because it's something that has come up a little bit, you know, when digging into this workplace mental health world, and realizing that, you know, when you come from working in a more of a caring organization, that when you move over into other sectors, empathy isn't something that everyone's born with. And it can be surprising when you hear people often talking about empathy being an issue they find at their organization, because it's not something that comes naturally to everyone. And so is it possible to build empathy and to learn that?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Empathy, like many things, is a skill. It's not always an easy skill to acquire. And I think it ties in to some degree with the concept of emotional intelligence, which is something that, you know, most leaders are very familiar with. It's you know, it's considered to be one of the most in-demand sets of skills for the next, you know, decade. But empathy starts with a fundamental understanding of feelings, and there are varying degrees to which acceptance of feeling anything exists within work cultures across Canada. And you know, part of our goal at CMHA, you know, within the workplace context is you know, you can distill it down to bringing the human element back to the workplace. But so, you know, when people ask me how do I build empathy, where do I start? I often say it's about starting with your own emotional vocabulary. So learning to identify and label the things that you're feeling is often the best place to start, and practice that first. And then you'll be able to, over time, generalize that and put yourself in other people's shoes and understand how they're feeling. The other big thing is sort of a discussion around empathy versus sympathy. And you know, I often say that there's a place for both, because sympathy involves, in some ways, sharing of your own experience in a way that can be helpful for someone else. But when people ask me, well, should I stop using sympathy and just lean into empathy? I say, well, I would actually just say empathy first is really my motto, right? So it's okay to talk about how you're doing and what your experience was with X, Y, and Z, because there is an element of that that can be helpful for people. It gives them an idea of how they could get through it and support themselves, but empathy comes first. Empathy before sympathy.
Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate that. Liz, what do you like to add?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I find that with the discussion about leadership and empathy, it's so helpful for people when they have leaders who do put themselves out there and share their experiences. But what we find also is that leaders need to be able to really listen and hear what it is that their employees are going through, or the people that they're leading are going through. And not just about what they're going through, but what their fears are, what their concerns are, what they're struggling with, and what they need for support. And so when we talk about the role of leadership, I mean, if we look at the national standard, one of the key workplace factors in there is clear leadership and expectations. So, you know, the role of leadership is to provide clarity, and there's no time like in the midst of an emergency or a disaster such as a pandemic that is more important. So leadership becomes, like, the importance of leadership becomes heightened in times like this. And the reason for that is that we are surrounded in situations like this with uncertainty and change, widespread change that is affecting so many people so suddenly. And a lot of this change is, it's not only sudden, but people feel that they don't have any control, and they don't know what the next steps are. They don't know what the future holds. And there's been impacts in you know, in their family, in their wider circles, in their work. And so it really is incumbent upon leaders to step up to the bat and say, okay, what do we need to do here to help to reduce that level of uncertainty, to bring clarity to, you know, what are people expected to do? Where can they go for information? What are the safety measures that we're putting in place to protect our workers and to protect our customers, to protect, you know, if we're dealing with vendors or if we're dealing with members of the public, what are those safety measures that we have to put in place? And then the communication has to come in there. So there's an aspect of what do we need to communicate? Who do we need to communicate it to? When does that communication have to go out? How often do we need to communicate it? What are the different modes of communication that we need to make sure? So really having that whole communication strategy in place is so critically important. And when doing that communication, that's where definitely the empathy and the sympathy come in, and the vulnerability, because a leader who is just going out and saying, okay, here's what we have to do, without having that empathy and being able to say, okay, how are the decisions that we're making going to impact the people who we're expecting to carry them out? That can come across very difficult. And when we're dealing with these kinds of situations, everyone is at such a heightened level of stress. So the idea is that we want to be able to communicate in a way that gives clarity, gives direction, listens to people's needs, but also when we're giving that direction and clarity, that we're doing it in a way that helps to lower the stress levels. Because what we want to do is be able to help people see that we are able to lead them through this. It increases trust that people have in their leadership when they know that the leadership is effective. And so when we look at the national standard, you know, you look at the various workplace factors there. In providing that clear leadership, look at the rest of the workplace factors to see what are the things that we need to have in place that would help to support our employees or help to support those people that we're leading. And so things like, as Anja mentioned earlier, the whole issue around civility and respect, and the fact that we're seeing an increase in xenophobia and discrimination and harassment. And so, you know, as a leader, don't wait for people to come forward with reports that this is happening. Communicate to people up front that we're seeing that these things are happening in the general public, and that you're not going to tolerate it within your own organization, and encourage people to come forward if they are experiencing those kinds of things, because there's a responsibility for leaders to make sure to protect their workers. And it's, you know, it's not to be tolerated among workers or from the public or, you know, in the workplace at all. So that's one of the main things that I think people really need to get out there. And also, you know, really recognizing when people are at a higher level of risk, whether it's a risk of physical injury or a risk of mental injury, you know, people who may be struggling or experiencing mental health challenges or other chronic illnesses or chronic pain, or they may have low immunity. There may be a number of reasons why they may be at increased risk of injury or illness. So really helping to figure out, you know, how do we protect people from that increased risk? What are the things that we need to put in place? And sometimes you may need to encourage people to self-identify. So in doing that, you'll also need to, while you're asking people to identify if they may be at an increased risk, that may be partially looking at the workplace and saying, okay, what are the hazards that they are exposed to, whether it's exposure to the influenza pandemic itself, or they may be at increased risk of injury from other hazards in the workplace as a result of having to deal with the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So you have to look at all of those kinds of things and put the right controls in place. And then for people who may be at higher risk, they may need accommodation.
Yeah, and just to kind of share a practice, building on what Liz has shared. Every Friday we have a management meeting. We have a very small team. It's about 15 folks or so at the national office, so not very large, but very dynamic. And the workload has increased because advocacy and communications are becoming even more important in the digital age. One of the things we've been grappling with is, when it is safe to go back to the office, what should that look like? Many of us perhaps are in walking or public transit distance to our office, but some of us may actually need to take the GO train. What does that look like, the journey to work, and some of the anxieties that might be present there? So we've actually, one of the practices we've been implementing is, we want to have a co-creation process. Think about, each person might have a different, unique process of even just physically getting to work. So what types of accommodations should be made, or what types of considerations should we have? And I think people have felt a greater sense of security having those open dialogues where everyone's kind of co-creating what that solution back to work could look like. So that's one thing I wanted to kind of share. Another piece, more practically speaking, just thinking about right now, there's a lot of health anxiety because of this global pandemic, but there is a lot of, rightly so, a lot of economic anxiety. So really speaking about that, whether it's, it might not be that a worker that's working with you, but another person in their household may have had a job loss, for example. So one of the practical examples I've seen, one of my good friends, Nadine, she's actually started to say, like, listen, we know that it's a very anxious time for a lot of people looking for work or in that transition phase. So what I'll do is start to reach out to my network and put in a good word for you. Or, tell me if you're facing an economic challenge finding work, let me leverage my network. So I think sometimes, you don't need to have the leadership title in your position in your title, your job title, but you can always be a leader in your community. So I think that's a practical way if folks are wondering how they can support fellow folks. I think that would also help lessen the economic anxiety that is quite present, I think, in many of the places that we may be part of. So I think I wanted to share that as a practical step, because sometimes people might be wondering, what can I do as an individual? I don't have, that fancy title in my name, but that's a small step that someone can take.
Thank you, Anjum. And if you don't mind, that actually leads really nicely into our top question that we have from the audience. So if you guys are ready, I want to go into that because I think that these are some really great questions that they have. So the first one is, what advice do you have for rising leaders to influence and advocate for the importance of mental wellness who aren't necessarily in leadership roles at their workplace?
That is an awesome question, with not necessarily any easy answers, but I think maybe I'll start with my hope. And my hope is that in the context of going back to the workplace for many people, and in the context of this pandemic, it's going to be a lot easier to convince employers that they need to pay attention to the mental health of their workforce. I think already we're seeing an increased dialogue in corporate Canada, and even public and nonprofit sectors about how important this is. So, I mean, key number one is that I think it's actually going to be easier than you think to get people to pay attention to this. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, I guess, is maybe making the connection. And again, a lot of it depends on your organizational culture, but making the connection between health and productivity is one of the, I guess, one of the most impactful ways to make the case for more support for mental health, is to say that really, just like your physical health, if you're mentally unwell, you're not going to be doing the job to the best of your ability. And any employer wants their team performing at their best. And quite simply put, if you're not experiencing mental health, you're likely not performing your best work. So there's a lot of other things depending on your role, and you can talk about the cost of not addressing it, which is one strategy. But I think by and large, employers recognize the financial impact by now. It's more about getting them to commit to taking action and get that momentum moving forward. That's my sense. So Hopefully it's easier after this pandemic, or as this pandemic starts to resolve. And then the other thing would be, I think, really make the clear case to say that if I'm mentally healthy, I'm just going to do better work.
Thanks, Jordan. Les,
Totally.
do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that looking at the individual business case and being able to say, how does it actually impact our organization in people's results, what they're able to do, what the customers are thinking, what our organizational reputation is for a company that actually cares about our employees. That's going to be really big coming out of this, or coming through this pandemic, is, how do we actually treat our employees, especially in this day of social media where, everybody talks about what's going on. And, if it's a great company, we see it on social media. People talk about their organizations and what a great leader they have, or what a great manager they have. On the other hand, we know that people leave organizations when they aren't treated well, and when they really feel that that the organization has not protected them, or that they have a problem with their manager or supervisor. But I think that there's one other thing that comes into it when you're trying to, as a rising leader, to help your organization move forward with the importance of mental health, is to help them not only to see what the business case is, but offer some solutions. Because very often people will think that it may be difficult to put these things in place. And if we're able to offer solutions and show how to do it, or provide tools that, there's a lot of free tools available, but there's also a lot of other support that's available as well. There's a lot of organizations that are helping people with implementing mental health within the workplace. So there is help available, and the solutions are there. So, if you come forward and you talk about the business case, and talk about, here's some solutions that we can put in place, and do it in kind of a staged way, dealing with maybe those most important things first, but also have some, deal with some of that low-hanging fruit, those quick wins that will really make a difference right away. And you'll start to see progress going forward.
Yeah, and if I could add, I think there's so many different ways to make an impact and be a positive influence. I think one of the things right now, people are really curious. They want to know what are the, unintended consequences or impacts of this crisis in multiple different ways. So I think as a leader, or as an emerging leader, if you can, put up your hand and say, I'd love to host a lunch and learn, and do something where everyone kind of comes together at a lunchtime, because I know it's challenging doing that when you're remotely, when you're working physically distanced, and have an interesting presentation. See if you can invite an organization to come in and do a talk. That's something that's intellectually stimulating. People will learn more, and they might also be interested in giving back and connecting, going back to that service and volunteering piece. But this is like a way to kind of enter into those conversations. I also just want to share, during this time, we've also been talking about the fact that there's a shadow pandemic, which is the rise in domestic violence. And so this is something as employers, if someone's physically coming into the workplace, this might be something that you can start to see the red flags. But when someone is physically distanced, that's hard. And these are very challenging conversations. So I want to point people to a resource by the Canadian Women's Foundation. What they've actually done is for people who are physically distanced, want to show that they need help. They've actually created a signal that you can put on Zoom calls, or there's even a special background for Zoom that you can put up if you're sensing that you need help. So I really want to encourage people to share this out. And again, it goes back to what Liz was saying, being proactive about these conversations, because if it might not actually be impacting anyone in your workplace, but they can share that information with other people in their network, right? So it's all about kind of ensuring that these resources go out. I think something else I've seen people do are hosting water cooler chats through Zoom, and this being a way to bring people together, because it seems now when you're having a meeting, you kind of book things just for meetings, but not really for those social activities. So our workplace is starting to have like a water cooler Zoom chat on Fridays. And so that's a great way for people to just kind of come in and chat a bit. And it's not about work, it's about just like life, which is nice. So those are some, I guess, practical tips that people can take on and introduce to your organization.
Those are some great tips. And would you mind sharing that resource with us, the domestic violence resource, and we can share it with our team?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for all those tips, everyone. I think we can get to one last question. And it is, what are some strategies you're using as leaders to check in with and support your own team members?
So maybe I can quickly share a couple of things. I have a bullet points here. So one is just going back to that flexible work piece. We were fortunate before the pandemic, and I think many workplaces had perhaps a remote work policy, but that's really being tested. So thinking about how that can be modified for this time, there might be other things that are coming up. But for us, you know, in many ways, it doesn't matter when you work as long as you get the work done. So if people want to start at 6 and end earlier because they have care duties with their children, that's okay. And communicating that, I think that's been really great for the parents on our team. We also, going back to that economic piece, people are spending time at home. They're using their own internet and their own phones. So we've immediately put in internet top-ups and phone top-ups on people's paycheck. So that is a cost they don't have to worry about. We've also, I think the last thing I'll say is many of us may also be leaders outside of our paid work. You might be on an advisory board or on a board of an organization. I think board members can also play an important role in boosting morale. So think about, you know, is there a way for you to join that virtual town hall at your organization's workplace that you're a board member of? People really like to hear that, you know, the board cares. So I think that's another way for folks from the ELN network, if you're engaged in that way. Share that with the executive director or CEO and see if you can, you know, support the organization in that way.
Thank you. Liz, did you want to say anything? You
don't
have to.
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Sure. It's what are you doing yourself as a leader to check in with and support your own team members? Right.
Yes. I was so intrigued by what Anjum was saying, and yeah, I was taking a few notes there too. Yeah, so I am a team of 1 right now. I don't have employees yet, but I'm looking at bringing on some people very soon, so putting some things in place there. But I'm part of a team of managers at my workplace. So when it comes to helping to support each other, you know, we're practicing all those things, being there, listening, offering support with each other. One of the things that I'm trying to be very aware of, though, as I'm doing that, is how much I'm asking of other people, and being aware of that, that they all have so much on their plates as well, and that even if I need something done and I know that there's resources there to help me, trying to be cognizant of their time, their energy, not overloading them, making sure that I ask and don't just give it to them. Can you do this? And is there someone who can help out with things like this? So just taking time to do that. And yeah, and we've been connecting with the kind of the fun stuff as well that our committee has put out, and different things like that. So the check-ins from our leaders, and it's been pretty good. Yeah,
the fun stuff helps, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Jordan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, let's see the fun stuff. My team, I've got a team of about 6 people, as if there's like a half person in there somewhere. I have a team of 6 people. And for the first time, we did Zoom house tours the other day, so that was a fun thing. Yeah, I'm doing some renovations in my house, so I took them through all of that. But I think the biggest key for me has been making it's similar to what Anjum has described, but it's making space for those human-to-human interactions that we would normally get in a physical workplace that now suddenly feel odd in a virtual workplace, right? You know, you book a call, you get on the call, you maybe spend 60 seconds chatting about your day and the weather, and then you get on with it. And there's so much of our work that fits in all the in-between spaces. And it's all of that connection that's really good for our mental health. So whatever you do to build that in, and whether it's a virtual water cooler, I've gotten into the habit of every Monday just calling my team at the end of the day individually, asking them how their weekend was, you know, what do they have up for the week, what's something they're looking forward to, and then building that relationship just human to human. You know, however you as a leader find space to do that, just make sure to do it. It's so incredibly important. And until you're working in a remote setting, you don't necessarily realize how critical that human-to-human interaction is. And the other thing, and that has been an interesting realization for me is being good at accepting kindness. And so, you know, kindness in and of itself have an element of contagion to them, right? So COVID-19 is contagious, but so is kindness. And you know, when you're doing something kind, you actually get something out of it yourself, right? And so it's an interesting thing being a leader and actually reorienting yourself to be willing to accept support and kindness from your team. So that's been something that I've been trying to work on. Admittedly, it's a hard thing. But especially for people that are in the healthcare profession that my team is in, right? It's the reason we do the work we do is to help other people and to show that kindness and compassion. And so I often think that I'm doing a disservice if I don't accept their kindness and compassion as well.
That's really nice, Jordan. Thank you for all of those wonderful tips, all of you. Actually, one of my colleagues who might be on right now, and I hope he's listening, he actually organized a trivia today for our team. Everyone sent in a fun fact about themselves, and he set up a whole trivia game where you had to guess, you know, had the fact, and then you had to guess who it was, and everyone was just having the best time. And you know, setting aside some time to be playful and be humans together outside of just, you know, just work. It happens naturally when you're in the office, and it doesn't happen naturally when you're virtual. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for contributing to such a rich discussion. Liz, Enjum, Jordan, on behalf of all of us at the Emerging Leaders Network, thanks again for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us. We really appreciate it. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you. If you shared ideas in the chat box about resources you're leaning on to protect your own mental well-being, thanks for that. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to collect your ideas and distribute a list to everyone who registered for today's webinar. Before I kind of close things off, does anyone have any kind of last minute thoughts that they'd want to add?
I just want to really thank you for doing this webinar. I think that, you know, the discussion has been fantastic. I mean, we all learn things from each other. You know, Jordan, Anjum, I was taking some notes while you were talking, and, you know, Carly, I just want to really thank you for doing this. And thanks CivicAction. It's just a fantastic organization, and I feel so honored to have been asked to participate. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Okay. So for everyone who's still on the line, we're at about 6 o'clock. I'm just going to close things off now. So if you have to run, I understand. If you're interested in other great programming, CivicAction also just launched a new phase of Digital Dish to crowdsource ideas on 3 issues facing our region related to COVID-19. So reemployment, mental well-being, and building and maintaining trust in our communities and leaders. So if you want any more information about that and about how to host a digital dish, it's super simple. So you can just check it out on civicaction.ca/digitaldish. Otherwise, thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.